remember the exact moment I realized my family had already spent money that wasn't theirs. It wasn't said directly. No one ever said it directly. That would have required honesty. Instead, it slipped out the way truth often does, carelessly, wrapped in laughter that wasn't meant for me. We were gathered around my daughter Corinne's dining table, the kind she insisted on calling oak, even though anyone with a trained eye could see it was veneer. Appearances mattered to her. They always had. The table was set too formally for a casual Sunday dinner. Cloth napkins, polished glasses, candles that hadn't been lit but were clearly there for effect. I sat at the far end where I always sat. Not by instruction, but by quiet agreement. The seat that allowed everyone else to face each other while I remained slightly removed, present, but not central. It had been like that for years. "Mom, you should really think about downsizing," Corinne said, cutting into her chicken with unnecessary force. "That house is too much for you now. Too much." The phrase lingered in the air like a diagnosis. Across from her, my son David nodded, not looking at me but at his plate. "Yeah, it's not practical anymore. Maintenance alone," his wife Linda chimed in before he could finish. "And the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. You could sell and get something smaller, easier. Easier, practical, downsizing." They spoke like advisors, like people concerned about my well-being. But there was something else underneath it. Something sharper, quieter. I smiled the same way I always did. Soft, agreeable, harmless. "Managed so far," I said. Linda gave a small laugh. "But for how long?" There it was, not concern, calculation. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, buying myself a moment. Silence, I'd learned, often revealed more than words ever could. Corinne leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "We're just trying to help, Mom. You don't want things to get complicated later." Later. The phrase echoed in my mind. Later, when I was gone. Later, when there would be something to divide. I looked around the table, at my children, their spouses, their subtle glances at one another. There was an unspoken conversation happening beneath the spoken one. A shared understanding that didn't include me, or rather, one that assumed I didn't understand. And that was the moment I realized something had already shifted. Not in me, in them. Because they weren't discussing my future, they were discussing their expectations. I've always lived simply. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. After my husband passed, the house felt too big, too quiet. People assumed I stayed because I couldn't afford to leave. That was easier for them to believe than the truth, that I stayed because it held memories I wasn't ready to let go of. I drove the same car for 12 years. I wore clothes until they wore thin. I clipped coupons, paid in cash, avoided unnecessary expenses. To them, it looked like limitation. To me, it was discipline. But perception has a way of becoming reality, at least in the minds of those who benefit from it. And my family had built an entire narrative around mine. The conversations didn't stop after that dinner. They multiplied, subtle at first, then sharper, more frequent. Corinne began calling more often, her tone carefully balanced between concern and suggestion. "Have you thought more about the house?" David started dropping by unannounced, walking through rooms as if assessing them, not visiting. Linda asked questions that felt oddly specific. "Do you have a will in place?" she said one afternoon, stirring her tea as though it were casual conversation. "I do," I replied. "Oh," she said, just a fraction too quickly. "Well, that's good, just making sure everything, organized. Organized, everything had to be organized for them." I noticed the way they exchanged looks when I spoke. The way conversations paused when I entered a room. The way decisions were discussed around me, not with me. They thought I was fatting, becoming smaller, easier to manage, and I let them think it. Because sometimes, the greatest advantage is being underestimated. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when family meant something different. I remember Christmas mornings when the house was loud with laughter, not layered with tension. When Corinne would run down the stairs in her pajamas, and David would pretend he wasn't excited, even though he always was. Back then, money wasn't a subject, love was. But time has a way of revealing what people value most. And sometimes it isn't what you. First real crack came during a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I had gone upstairs at Corinne's house to find my coat. Voices drifted from the kitchen below, low but not low enough. "She has to sell eventually," Linda was saying. "Yeah," David replied. "It's just a matter of time." "And when she does," Corinne's voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy. I stood still at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the railing. "And when she does," Linda continued, "we need to make sure things are fair." Fair, a word that can mean anything when defined by those who stand to gain. "She doesn't have that much anyway," David said. I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, not yet, clarity, because they weren't just assuming. They were planning based on an illusion they believed was real, and that illusion was me. I went back downstairs slowly, making just enough noise to announce my presence. The conversation stopped instantly. Karen turned, smiling too quickly. "Did you find your coat?" "I did," I said. No one mentioned what had just been said. No one needed to. The silence said everything. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not because I was hurt, but because I was thinking, replaying conversations, re-examining moments, connecting pieces that had once seemed insignificant, the questions about my finances, the suggestions about selling the house, the quiet urgency beneath their words. It wasn't concern. It was anticipation. They were waiting for a moment they believed would come sooner rather than later, a moment when control would shift from me to them, and the most dangerous part, they thought it already had. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was how wrong they were. Because while they had been watching my present, they had completely ignored my past, the decisions I'd made, the choices I'd kept to myself, the investments, the accounts, the quiet, deliberate life I had built, not just to survive, but to secure something far beyond what they imagined. I had never spoken about it. Not out of secrecy, but out of habit. Privacy had always been my comfort. Now it was my advantage. In the weeks that followed, their behavior became more obvious, more confident. As if they were slowly stepping into roles they believed were already theirs. Karen began discussing renovations to the house, as if she would be the one living there. David mentioned selling, when the time comes, with an ease that felt rehearsed. Linda asked about account access. Each conversation layered on top of the last, building a quiet, undeniable truth. They weren't just assuming I had little. They were counting on it, counting on simplicity, on limitation, on me being exactly who they thought I was. And I realized something then. The illusion wasn't just theirs, it was mine too, because I had allowed it, encouraged it even, by staying quiet, by saying less, by living in a way that invited underestimation. But what they saw as weakness was never weakness, it was restraint. And restraint, when held long enough, becomes power. One afternoon, David sat across from me in my living room, his posture unusually formal. "We should probably go over your finances," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Should we?" "Just to make sure everything's clear," he replied. Clear. Another word that sounded helpful but wasn't. "I've managed them just fine," I said. He nodded, but I could see the impatience in his eyes. "Yeah, but things happen. Illness, decline, loss of control." He wasn't saying it directly, he didn't have to. "I'll let you know if I need help," I said. It was a dismissal, polite but firm. And for the first time, I saw something flicker across his face, not concern, frustration, because I hadn't played the part he expected. That was when I knew this wasn't just about money, it was about control, about who held it. And who assumed they would. That night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents, statements, records, proof, not of what they believed, but of what was real. I sat there for a long time, looking at numbers that told a story no one else knew, a story of patience, of discipline, of quiet decisions made over decades, a story that stood in complete contrast to the one my family had created. And I realized something that changed everything. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had revealed themselves, every assumption, every whispered conversation, every calculated suggestion. It wasn't about what I had, it was about who they were. I closed the drawer gently, not out of fear, but out of control, because truth, I understood now, isn't powerful just because it exists. It's powerful because of when it's revealed. And timing is everything. So I said nothing. I let them continue, let the conversations grow bolder, let the assumptions deepen, because the more certain they became, the harder the truth would hit. And by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. The moment I decided to stop being silent wasn't loud. There was no confrontation, no sudden declaration. It was quiet, intentional, final, because silence had protected me. But now it was time to use it. I didn't begin with my family. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I began with the truth, real truth, documented, verified, untouchable. 3 days after that conversation with David, I made a call I should have made years ago, not out of necessity, but out of clarity. "Good morning, this is Harper and Cole," the voice on the other end said. "Name is Margaret Ellis," I replied. "I'd like to schedule a meeting." Was a brief pause, papers shifting, keys tapping. "Of course. What is this regarding?" I allowed myself a small breath before answering. My estate. The office was nothing like my children would have expected, not grand, not intimidating. Just clean, quiet, and efficient. The kind of place where things didn't need to appear important, they simply were. Mr. Cole himself greeted me. Mid-60s, steady eyes, the kind of presence that didn't rush. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, shaking my hand. "Please come in." I sat across from him, placing my bag gently on the desk. "What can I help you with?" he asked. For a moment, I simply looked at him, not because I didn't know what to say. Because this was the first time I was saying it out loud. "I need everything reviewed," I said. "Assets, accounts, property, and I want to make changes." He nodded, not surprised, not questioning. "Of course," he said. "Let's begin." It took 3 meetings to go through everything, 3 meetings for someone else to see what my family had never bothered to understand. Investment portfolios, rental properties, long-term accounts quietly growing over decades, insurance policies structured with intention. Even the house they kept calling too much wasn't what they thought it was. Nothing was. At the end of the second meeting, Mr. Cole leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully, "I assume your family is aware of your financial position." I smiled. I said, "They're not." He studied me for a moment, not with judgment, but with curiosity. "Would you like them to be?" he asked. I paused. Because that was the question, wasn't it? Not whether they could know, but whether they should. "Not yet," I said, and in that moment the plan began to take shape. Meanwhile, my family continued exactly as they had before, confident, certain, careless. Karen started sending me listings for smaller homes. "Look at this one," she said during one call. "It's perfect for you, cozy, manageable." I could hear the unspoken part, controllable. David grew more direct. "You really should simplify things," he told me over coffee. "It'll make everything easier later." Later, always later. Linda, of course, became more strategic. "Just want to avoid complications," she said sweetly. "It's better to plan ahead." Plan ahead, they all had the same idea, just different ways of saying it. And every time they spoke, I listened, not as a mother, not as someone hurt, but as someone observing, because the clearer they became, the easier my decisions were. At my third meeting with Mr. Cole, everything was laid out. "Your estate is substantial," he said plainly. "More than substantial, actually." I nodded. "I know. You'd like to make changes." "Yes," leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what you want." What I want, it sounded simple, but it wasn't about money, it was about meaning. "I want it to reflect reality," I said. "And what is that reality?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Respect," I said, "or the lack of it." Didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He understood. We began restructuring everything carefully, legally, permanently, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Certain assets were reassigned. Conditions were added. Decisions were made that my family would never have expected, because they were based on truth, not assumption. I didn't remove them entirely. That would have been easy. Instead, I made something far more powerful. I made it fair, truly fair, not equal, not assumed, but earned. And that distinction would matter. Weeks passed, and the more prepared I became, the more careless they grew. Karen started talking about when the house sells as if it were already decided. David mentioned splitting, whatever's left in front of me, not even realizing what he was revealing. Linda asked if I had considered giving them early access to help manage things, early access to something they didn't understand. It would have been almost amusing if it weren't so telling. The breaking point came sooner than I expected, and not because I forced it, but because they did. "Mom, we need to talk," Karen said one afternoon, her tone unusually firm. I knew immediately this wasn't a suggestion, it was a move. "All of us," she added, "all of us." I agreed. Of course I did. Because the moment had arrived. We met at Karen's house again, the same table, the same seats, but everything felt different because this time I wasn't observing, I was ready. David sat with his arms crossed. Linda had papers in front of her. Karen looked determined. "We've been discussing things," she began, we not including me. "And we think it's time to make some decisions," she continued. "About what?" I asked calmly. She exchanged a glance with David. "Your situation," he said, "my situation." I almost smiled. "We're concerned," Linda added, "about your future and about making sure everything is handled properly." Properly, there it was again, control disguised as care. Karen leaned forward. "We think it would be best if you sold the house," she said. "Soon, while the market is good." "Then what?" I asked. "We can help you find something smaller," David said, "and manage the rest." The rest, of course. I looked at each of them, one by one, not with anger, but with clarity. "You've already decided all of this," I said. It wasn't a question. Karen hesitated, just slightly. "We're just trying to help," she said. Help, the word had never sounded so hollow. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and placed a folder on the table. Their eyes followed the movement instantly, curiosity, expectation, assumption. "All of you have been very busy," I said. No one spoke. "Have I?" I opened the folder. and for the first time I stopped letting them guess. "What is that?" David asked. "Reality," I replied. I slid the first document across the table. Investment summaries, numbers that didn't align with anything they believed. Corinne's expression shifted first, confusion, then disbelief. This can't be right," she said. "It is," I said calmly. Linda leaned forward, scanning the page. Her confidence faltered. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "From my life," I said. I placed another document down, property records, not just the house, others, plural. David's posture changed. The certainty gone, replaced with something else. He began, but he didn't know how to finish because there was nothing he could say. "You assumed a lot," I said quietly. No one denied it. "You assumed I needed help," I continued. Silence. "You assumed there wasn't much to manage." Karen looked down. "You assumed wrong." The room felt smaller now, heavier, because the illusion they had built was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "I met with a lawyer," I said. Linda's head snapped up. Of course it did. That was the part she understood best. "I've reviewed everything," I continued. "And I've made decisions." "What kind of decisions?" David asked, his voice tighter now. The shift was complete: confidence to uncertainty, expectation to fear. "The kind that reflect reality," I said. I placed the final document on the table, the revised will. Karen stared at it but didn't reach for it, as if touching it would make it real. "What is this?" she asked. "You wanted things organized," I said. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. David leaned in. Linda watched both of them. And for the first time, they weren't looking at me like I was behind. They were looking at me like they had never known me at all. "This is," Corinne started, then stopped. "Because it's final," I said. "You changed everything," David asked. "Yes," Linda demanded. That was the question, wasn't it? Why, not how, not what, but why. I met her gaze. "Because I paid attention," I said. No one spoke because they knew. Every conversation, every assumption, every moment they thought I didn't notice, I had. "It's not about punishment," I continued. It wasn't. That would have been easy. Karen's eyes filled with something, regret, maybe, or realization. "It's about truth," I said. "This," I gestured to the document, "is what truth looks like." Leaned back in his chair, defeated. "We were just trying to help," I interrupted gently. He didn't finish because we both knew. That wasn't what it had been. Linda was the only one who hadn't looked away. "You can't seriously expect us to accept this," she said. Her voice still carried resistance, still held onto something. Expectation, perhaps. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. "It's not about what you accept," I said. "It's about what is." And that was the moment it ended, not the conversation, not the relationship, but the illusion. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had shifted everything. I gathered my things slowly, standing up without urgency, without hesitation. Corinne said quietly. I paused, but I didn't turn around immediately because for the first time she didn't sound certain. "I didn't know," she said. I looked at her then, and for a moment I saw something real, not entitlement, not calculation, just realization. "I know," I said, and that was the problem. I left without another word. Because there was nothing left to explain. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't expected, not anger, not sadness, but something quieter, lighter, because for years I had been seen as less capable, less aware, less significant, and now that version of me no longer existed. When I got home, I walked through each room slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. This house, this life, everything I had built, quietly, deliberately, without recognition, without assumption. It had always been mine, not just legally, but truly. The phone rang later that evening. I let it because not every call deserves an answer. In the days that followed, messages came, some apologetic, some defensive, some silent, each one revealing something different, but none of them changing anything because the truth doesn't bend once it's revealed. I met with Mr. Cole one final time. "Everything is in place," he said. I nodded. "Good." He studied me for a moment. "You handled that well," he said. I smiled slightly. "I handled it honestly," I replied, and that made all the difference. As I walked out of his office, I realized something important. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about finally seeing clearly, seeing who they were, and who I was without illusion. Because in the end, money doesn't reveal character, it exposes it. And what my family thought was theirs was never really about money at all. It was about assumption. And assumption is the most expensive mistake anyone can make.